Today I'd like to talk about the word trauma and its meaning because it's a very popular word at the moment. We're hearing it everywhere. People are weaving it into their language and vocabulary saying, oh, I'm really traumatized. That triggered me. Now I have trauma. You just hear it used so many different ways, and it turns up in places that you really don't expect. So what I want to do is I want to create a little bit of clarity about what trauma really is. It comes from a Greek word which means wound, to be wounded, which I'm sure makes perfect sense to you. Now, a wound can be a physical wound, it can be an emotional wound, a psychological wound. So yes, when people say they've been traumatized, they might be right. But let's unpack it a little bit and just get a better understanding of what it really means. There's some terms. So there's trauma, there's trauma response, trauma bond, trauma body, and I'll save the other two for last because they're the really positive side of it. So we know what trauma is, but there are two types of trauma. For sake of, explanation, what we say is there's big T trauma and small t trauma, or capital trauma and small trauma. And what that means is big T trauma are things like earthquakes, fires, accidents, hurricanes, tsunamis, things like that. And they're frequently collective. There's lots of people involved, but they can also be individual as well. A car accident can be individual, a house fire, etc. Small T trauma is more about the things that happen to us on a day-to-day basis that create trauma responses. And the easiest way of illustrating that would be what is called childhood developmental trauma, which I'm not going to go into at the moment. I'm going to be doing that on my course. But I just want to give you a little bit of background. Childhood developmental trauma it starts sometimes in utero, and the first 7 years of our lives is when we really develop our personality. So we might also develop personality adaptation. So we adapt our personality to respond to the things that traumatize us. And there's my ACEs quiz test on this platform, which I encourage all of you to take if you haven't already. 10 quick questions, and they all start with before the ages of 18, did you experience? So they could be divorce, was someone in your family incarcerated, were there substance abuse issues, alcoholism, things like that. Now, these can lead to childhood developmental trauma. They can really affect the child because the child grows up in a container, in an environment which is epigenetic of lots of negative things going on around them. And that can cause the child to adapt its personality with things like fawning, people-pleasing, knowing that its three basic needs to be seen, heard, and loved aren't being met in that moment, in those first 7 years of their lives, or less actually, and they go outside of self. So they shut self down and they go outside and they try to make everybody else happy, denying their own needs. And things like perfectionism, hypervigilism, OCD, and all of these things can be in this container. But as I said, I'll be going into this much more in depth in my course. So what is a trauma response? I've just explained it's responding with a personality adaptation, a coping strategy, a survival strategy to move away from the pain. So here's the pain, the child in the pain, so we move away. So we might become a perfectionist, an overachiever, hyper independent, things that I've talked about before, and I will go into some of those in days and weeks to come. So what is a trauma bond? A trauma bond is when two people have an interpersonal relationship and they're attracted to each other based on their traumas, and they're not even aware of it. I mean, very few people will be aware of this. That will be an unconscious behavior. So if we take the spectrum of dependency from codependency to narcissism, no dependence whatsoever, or it appears to be, both of those people come from a very similar kind of pain, but they split and take two different roads. So the narcissist, as you know, will be very needy from everybody else, make me feel good, tell me how wonderful I am. The golden child syndrome is very much in that, where the child is raised to believe that everything it does is right. And what has actually happened is the first year of our life is our narcissistic year, when we need everybody to do everything for us. And as we grow and evolve, we move out of that after the age of 3, when we get words and things like that, but they get stuck. On the other end of the spectrum is the codependent, very similar place they've come from in terms of pain, but what they've realized is they need people. They need to look after people. They need to fix people. They need to help people. They become people pleasers and they go outside of themselves. So these two opposite ends of the spectrum attract, which can create a very toxic and dysfunctional relationship. We will talk more about that as well another time. So that can be a trauma bond. That's just a great and easy illustration of what a trauma bond looks like. So they're both enmeshed in this relationship. It's dysfunctional. They're both unhappy. The narcissist may be frequently more happy than the codependent, but it's not going to be a healthy relationship. What is a trauma body? A trauma body is when we don't heal from those emotional wounds that we had, and we store the emotion in our body, and it affects us physically. So very, very briefly, I have had a trauma body. I stored a lot of stress and anxiety in my body for the first 30 years of my life. I wasn't aware of it. I was downloading a lot of adrenaline and cortisol, and I ended up with a heart rhythm problem. And I know this because it's non-pathological. There's no physical reason why I have it. So it's purely that I was reacting very, very negatively and very stressfully to my environment. What is a trauma like PTSD we talk about in CPTS? PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's usually in relationship to a big T trauma. It can be small as well, but that's like, let's say you had a car accident and that event is very much stuck in your head, or you were in a fire, or you were in a tsunami. So that is a little bit more specific. Complex post-traumatic stress will be layers. So I can share this with you because she's done a testimonial for me. I had a client when I was working in LA, and she had some developmental trauma, but then she was also in a very toxic relationship, codependent, narcissistic. She was physically abused, emotionally abused. Then a few years later, she was in a shootout, a random shootout in the road where a child got shot and injured, so she experienced that. And then she had a very serious car accident with life-changing injuries. So she has a complexity of traumas. And I'm going to finish with two really good uses of the word trauma. And this is what I do my work for to get to this point with my clients. The first one is, it's about when the body heals. So it's called post-traumatic growth. So that's the neuroplasticity of the mind changes. We view our trauma differently, and we begin to release it from our body. So this is a very positive aspect of trauma work. And the other one is post-traumatic wisdom, which I love. I just love that phrase. And that's when we really have wisdom. We have forgiveness of self because we've done the awareness, the 4 pillars of healing: awareness, acceptance, consciousness, and choice. And now we have wisdom. So we can look at ourselves differently. We see ourselves differently. We don't blame ourselves. We don't blame others. We don't blame our parents for how our life turned out. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge and the information they had. And this is why I do the work I do, because I always want to get post-traumatic growth for my clients and post-traumatic wisdom. So I hope that's helped to clarify trauma a little bit more. Thank you very much for joining me on this today, and stay safe.